Bitcoin Live today on Saturday, a special with Vesa. Welcome back to Bitcoin Live.
Nicolas, my friend, good to see you as always. It's been too long. And I have to say from the top of the interview that I have a pinched nerve in my back. So if occasionally I look a little pained or my tone of voice is not as jolly as it usually is, it's because I've really not had the greatest couple of days behind me when I have to sit down. So as much as I'm looking forward to this and really have so much to share and it'll be cool. If I look a little strained at times, please forgive me.
Well, thank you for being on despite those issues. And first of all, I want to thank you for. Now, I want to congratulate you of being the NFT Artist of the Year, winning it at the AIBC Summit in Dubai. Congratulations on achieving that. I mean, that's really something.
Thank you, my friend. That was a very special one because it was so many friends. I mean, we've built with them on ever since I think it was 2018 or something. We made the first Bitcoin artwork about Malta in specific, called the Magnificent Eight. That was a really cool artwork, and that started our relationship. We've done many things together, but it was so many quality companies, and it's a global enterprise that they put together. So to be awarded amongst so many friends and peers who are doing incredible things, that warmed the heart, legit.
And besides that, I mean, you're almost in everything. People who are following you, they sort of know that you're making these augmented car skins. You're doing the sneakers. You did Luxor with Superworld. I mean, you have musical events. You just won this prize. Can you tell us a little bit about all the stuff that you're working on and how are those progressing?
Well, actually, today was just a very cool day. Again, before our interview, we were at the absolutely stunning building that is the Museum of the Future here in Dubai, where we live with my wife. And Dr. Marwan Al Zarouni, the CEO of Dubai Blockchain Center, the absolutely phenomenal guy that we've been building these art cars with for now some time. There was a metaverse conference there with very high level people, and it was such an honor for him to show the minute-long video clip of our project together in this fantastic setting. And just a while ago, I listened to the mission statement of the director of the Museum of the Future in Art Dubai. I was entirely and completely blown away by how clearly someone can outline the vision of something. As a person who loves the movie Blade Runner ever since I was a kid, and how much that blew my mind when I watched it. It is very dystopian, as is most sci-fi fiction. And I thought about that before the museum opened here, the Museum of the Future. I was like, well, that is an incredibly difficult task. How could anyone outline what will be the things from the future worth preserving into a museum? How can you do that now? And I spent a little bit of time considering that philosophy wise, and thought that, anything that I'm going to hear from these people is going to sound ridiculous. And when I heard this guy speak on the stage and outline the positive mission, and the kind of way that they're going about uh, setting this whole movement in motion that is that museum, was so incredibly inspiring and wholesome and human and life affirming and positive that I can't speak of it highly enough. To be included in that setting in any kind of way, and it was a real honor. And before that, yesterday was cool. We with a musician called MKO,
Yeah.
who does these Afrofusion beats, and his incredibly talented friends. We did a concert at the Theater of Digital Art, Toda, last night, and it was quite a lot of African power and one white boy from Finland. So it was an incredible incorporation of something that I truly loved. I mean, I started listening to James Brown and Michael Jackson when I was 5 years old, and that kind of rhythm from African drums, that when it really starts and that dance in motion is just, it's an incredible thing to be a part of now in this kind of setting at what we had yesterday. So despite the pain, I'm a very happy man, and I'm very blessed man, and I'm grateful. Super grateful.
Know you've been working very, very hard. I think you're not somebody who likes to sit still. The last interview we did was with about Superworld and the Luxor Temple. And I think, that's sort of a theme within all your work. It's very holistic, right? You try to combine all the facets of human life and sort of celebrate them and put them into artistic form. I mean, you're sort of focused on fine art, but you're also open to technology and to see where the future is leading us. And can you tell us a little bit also about how the Luxor project developed further, and anything else that
Sure,
you
of
want to
course.
talk about?
Oh, but anything. We'll just go with the flow and keep this interesting, hopefully, to people as much as possible, and the vibes high. I mean, I don't even remember who said it, but it was something that life must be looked at backwards but lived forward. And part of the conversation that we now have about society quite often is that, in my opinion, we don't look far back enough and then not far enough into the future in order to see how to solve the problems that we have right now. And when I look at something like the Luxor Temple in Egypt and the wholesome worldview of that has influenced, by the way, the Western thought so much, even from the Abrahamic religions, of how much they borrowed from ancient Egypt and there on onwards. It's an incredible thing to witness that they built this temple that from the air, you look at it, it's built into the image of man, not gender specific, but just general, as in human.
Yeah.
And the story of this temple, from the feet to the head, actually tells the story of a pharaoh, of how you go from birth to transcendence. And this can be female or male, of course. And the idea that you have this enlightened leader who then keeps the story, the grand narrative, and how those poles in the middle, by the way, how they frame the Milky Way to the sky, of how they believe that the soul travels after you reach the transcendent stage, is something that we haven't really built for a long time to that degree. I mean, we have this sort of Earth-centric movement, this Save the Earth movement, and we're integrating harmoniously our living environments and recycling and being more harmonic with nature, which is obviously a great thing. But it doesn't take us to the spiritual level inside of buildings, and how to make them so that we also get supported on this non-materialistic kind of level from these structures that we are surrounded by. And this is, of course, something that the Luxor Temple stands for, so tall and so amazing when you really get to learn of what the teachings inside of a building can be. So I thought, what a better way than to reconstruct it in the metaverse and then have that be the support structure for the artistic content and vibration that I want to put out there, and kind of marry together the past, present, and future. What's the best from the past that we're not doing now, what is possible now, and where we could be taking this in the future. And that's an incredible thing to be a part of, and I'm super grateful for the Super World team for helping me achieve this. I mean, it was quite. I never thought just a few years ago that kind of a thing would have been possible. So again, blessings.
Yeah, no, and that's what I love about it. I mean, you have like a very broad scope. You have a very philosophical depth to your art, and that sort of resonates in everything you do. And you can almost see sort of where you want to go with all of this, where you sort of combine all these features, this holistic concept that you have, and bring it all back together, right? Because you basically what is happening is like the digital and the real world are merging, and you are sort of exploring all the aspects, all the points where they sort of meet, and where you can sort of enhance it through artistic and fine art sensibilities, right?
Very well put. I mean, it's one thing that I see quite often, because I also do a lot of public speaking on stages, and I listen to very many people curiously, because I'm super curious about ideas altogether, and it needs to be ingrained in a vision, which is very hard to do. And most people have very busy lives, and they work, and they have families, and they whatever. So in one setting, I'm quite fortunate that I have taken the time, and due to my profession, I have almost a duty to dwell into these questions very deeply to try and understand what would be a solution. And sometimes you don't have solutions, you only have trade-offs, which is mostly the case. And you have to be quite considerate that all of a sudden something that feels like progress isn't regress, and then regress doesn't end up actually showing as progress because of that. And that might sound a little complicated, but if you don't, for example, study what happened in the last century with some of the things that we're experimenting with now, thinking that those things are progress which have been tried, that already resulted in cataclysmic errors, even though the systems and many things have evolved, it's still, if you don't get to know those philosophical ideas, then you're just endlessly repeating history. And this is what I'm trying to avoid with these kinds of things. So what is the inclusion of a variety of ideas that are fighting amongst each other, that need to be able to keep each other in check when they do that. And this is why I so much appreciate your platform, because and your mind, because we always get to talk about these super deep subjects and kind of hash it out in the same tradition that I believe is absolutely necessary for humanity, is that we need to be able to express these ideas. We need to be able to have the fight of ideas in the public forums, or otherwise they get pathologized, and then many bad things happen. So because my vision is a very hopeful and optimistic one for humanity, and I want us to do as well as possible, even at my own expense, I bring up sometimes problems that aren't most beneficial to myself to do so. But I believe in the big mission of humanity to go forward in the best kind of way, and for us to grow. So that's more important sometimes than the individual, right? Even though I think the individual is very, very important, as ultimately in the new cultural context and in the sort of victim Olympics that we seem to be going with, is that once it's taken to its natural conclusion, you will realize that the individual is the ultimate minority.
Yeah, and I think, in your mixed media art, that sort of sense of balance and the balance self is very sort of clear. And I really also like why, like you already said, you look to the past and to the future, but you also look to the now, right? You also infuse the popular culture, popular sensibilities into your art, like, for example, Kenny here, but you have many other examples of those.
Oh, that's just funny. I mean,
Yeah.
Kenny was, I have to give the context to that one, because these are some of the early crypto artworks that we did, and kind of like this one in particular was that I was listening to a podcast, and the podcast host said, this is back in 2017, that Bitcoin is kind of like South Park's Kenny keeps dying and coming back to life. So it's Kenny that is kind of battle bruised and bloodied, but with Bitcoin eyes. And it's funny, but it's also an education. It's those kinds of things that lead us to the rabbit holes of why Bitcoin is important and what problems it solves.
No, yeah, but still, you use like these popular, iconic figures to sort of express those ideas, and you do that like unparalleled, and I really appreciate that that you sort of.
Thank you, my friend. Well, it's actually that's a very, very serious subject that I'd like to say something about, because I want to always promote the work of the great cultural critic Camille Paglia. And what she had to say about the global arts education program at the moment, because you see many people who are collecting art at the moment, and in this crypto space especially as well. You have all of these wealth symbols, you have the logos, of course, which we love, but the art language has been reduced to the world of popular culture quite often. It's something that is a Louis Vuitton symbol, or a Scrooge McDuck, or Monopoly, whatever, all of these new wealth kind of things, because art has started to borrow from popular culture its familiarity, because we don't really have an arts education program globally that makes us familiar with the masterworks of the past. We don't so much have a conversation about Michelangelo or Da Vinci, or even those things are still present in the museums. The museums haven't progressed fast enough into the era of augmented reality, or the metaverse, or this kind of thing, even though they're making great strands and kind of efforts towards it, but they haven't captured yet, with the historic thousands of years of lineage of art, into the youth culture, to the point of where, let's say, even up to the age of 40, people would be so comfortable in seeing the references from past, or infusing when something has been done that is actually new. And that makes the avant-garde art making very, very difficult, because if it's not in the public lexicon, then it becomes a forcing exercise to kind of impose something on the public that will just go like, hold on a minute, what is this? Why are you pushing this? I don't understand it, as opposed to utilizing familiar language. So in some sense, it's a dumbing down of the conversation of art, but it's not the fault of nearly anyone at this point. It's more like an encouragement of revitalizing the great tradition of art history education in our schools. And I think that is absolutely necessary. So many artists play these games, and I'm myself included, like with Kenny and other things, and implementing art on cars and all of these things to capture the imagination of people. But ultimately, what I am at heart is truly trying to achieve a new expression that would be capable of grasping something of the great tradition of art, which
Yeah.
would be something like a portal to our soul, to our future, this kind of thing. So it's
Basically, you're trying to revitalize and, like you say, reignite the imagination, because we have like a very, very rich heritage that most people have sort of lost track of. But where do you think that dislocation comes from? That people have sort of. Do you think it's like a natural occurrence that happens every 50 years or 100 years, or and that it has to reestablish or reconnect it, that we have to reconnect to our past, or do you think it's something different that has happened this century?
If I was smart enough to see the mind of God, I'm afraid I can only take wild stabs, not totally in the dark, but like Quentin Tarantino was saying, that we're now going through an age of repression, and then you have again a new kind of expression that springs from that. Usually, it takes about a decade to go through these different kind of motions, like the ocean's waves. I mean, it's in one way pointless to fight natural forces and the natural evolution of things, but it's also a little bit good to keep in mind where we are in the sort of context of the big picture. So a part of it is, I would say, the technological advancements that we've done, and going from the birth control pill. I don't think we've at all even begun to integrate the technology of the birth control pill and its impact on society to the degree that it's actually changed everything. And the female empowerment and coming into the workforce, dislocation of kind of different ideas and coming back with new ones, and so technology has advanced a lot. Our cultural context and conversation has changed and shifted so much that it's nearly impossible for even those who are super interested in this and have the time in the world to kind of pay attention to it to keep up with it. So to guess from that of what the big malaise is, the only thing I can maybe pinpoint is that we do seem to try to subscribe to trying to solve spiritual problems with materialistic solutions.
Yeah. So you would subscribe to the idea that society as a whole has become more superficial, and to sort of tie it also back to Bitcoin and crypto, especially Bitcoin, of course, that that our time preference has become shorter and shorter and shorter over time, and because it's a good thing to live in the here and now, of course, like the ancient traditions always admonish us, to be present. But most people live in the here and now to escape it, right? So they're actually not actually living in the here and now. But their time preference is becoming shorter and shorter, and they're not able to live in the future and in the past, it seems, because they're so swallowed up by the pressures of the here and now.
Absolutely that, but also just as a point of view, because we went to India for the first time with my wife just a few months ago. And it's one of those things is that we arrived to Kolkata, and we were there actually to bury my son who was born in childbirth. So it was quite a heavy journey, and it was a very confrontational and difficult thing to go and do, which we were called to do, and we felt it was the right thing to do. But once we got there, we landed to Calcutta. It was you have to understand the context of being a Finnish person from a very small country. We're 5 million. It's one of the cleanest countries in the world. We have an unnatural amount of personal space in between us. When we talk, it's like 2 meters. Otherwise, it's too uncomfortable. That kind of thing. and very, very loose geographically of how we're placed in there. And we arrived to Calcutta, and it's so loud, it's so polluted, it's so noisy. It's like it's an assault on your senses in every single kind of way that you can feel if you're more on this sort of spectrum of preferring very quiet and peace. So it was really a shock, and we left to go towards the Mayapur temple. And because my wife is Hare Krishna, and I'm very much with the community as well. We participate a lot in that here in Dubai, and that's quite an experience. It's been a real evolution for us spiritually, for the both of us. And once we got to the Mayapur temple, which is something incredible that they're building over there, it started opening up. There was so much suffering along the way of this whole 4-hour car journey that we took there, and it was like this ever expanding sort of streamline of poverty and kind of little kind of pockets of humanity, kind of in this not in the most empowered state, I would say. But because of this suffering, once you start to see the temple and what they've built there and what kind of a space that is in contrast to the general atmosphere of what was going on in West Bengal, that is the rocket fuel that takes people to this spiritual side, because it's not so comfortable in the material world. This is why they're so absolutely motivated to hold on to the tradition, to understand the tradition, to keep the learning alive from these Vedic texts from thousands and thousands of years ago that are infused with so much eternal wisdom that it's embarrassing that we don't know more about it. It's really like this kind of thing. So once we were there, and the other side of India, the true spiritual side of India, it grasped us as strong as the arrival to the Calcutta airport, if not more. So that to answer or kind of dwell into what you were saying is that once you have too much material comfort, our internal yearning for growth and combative nature and the search for the spiritual, which is necessary, starts to take up materialistic forms as opposed to the spiritual quest, because it's too comfortable. So that's the juxtaposition, I would say.
Yeah, and then in the same sort of vein, right? Because you're almost describing sort of the voyage of Siddhartha himself, like going through the streets and seeing the suffering, and then sort of reaching enlightenment in Buddhism. But you also
I didn't reach enlightenment, my friend. I wouldn't go that far. I got a glimpse of it, and that's when the real work starts. So it's only those who usually preach about the enlightenment, they've just gotten the first narcissistic stream of it, and then they become intolerable. So I don't want to be among that bunch.
No, true. But you also don't want to give people suffering, right? In order to sort of reach for the higher dimensions out there, right? So you would love to see people actually flourish and thrive and have a decent income and then make a decent living, while also being able to expand their self and reach a higher self-awareness at the same time, right? That you don't need that suffering that you describe in order to reach it.
No, well, that's the sort of what is missing from especially the Western cultural context conversation, is often that how I've learned how to see the world. And I think it was actually the great psychedelic Terence McKenna who said it, that the world is not a problem for the sociologists or the economists to solve. It's an eternal mystery. And what I kind of infused from it is that from the spiritual perspective, this is a school for the soul. And if you see the world as a problem, you will never solve it, because that's not what it was designed for. It's something, it's designed to be a problem for you to solve your individual journey of direction of where you want to go in a spiritual direction, also after you pass from this mortal coil. So if you start to take those kinds of things into consideration, that it's not meant to be fixed, because then the coming souls after you won't have their own mission to or their difficulties to combat. Of course, we have to have somewhat of a we don't want to create a North Korea situation or this kind of thing. So then, but we don't want to either have this lobotomized perfect little safe hubble bubble, which
Yeah.
will prevent your spiritual growth and your growth as a human being. So this is why it's the balance of support and challenge is absolutely important. And we now have this language which is all about safety and security from the sort of governmental or the new kind of um, mentality side, and everything to do with competition or challenge is bad because male is bad and whatever, this kind of thing. So we have these moments where we, like you said, that we go from, you know, this side to that side, and now we're off kilter. So again, like when I talk about some of these things, people think that I'm a conservative or something like that, which I'm definitely not. But I am an underdog defendant to the point of, if the mission is balanced and for us to go well into the future without catastrophe, and avoid it as much as possible, then you have to bring up the side of the conversation that is not being had at the moment, or otherwise the catastrophe is ensured.
Agree. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And for example, you got Neil Howe. He has like the fourth turning. I think he's actually just published a sort of sequel to that book, which was very influential. And it sort of speculates that you have this 100-year cycle, which is based on generations, and each cycle has to renew itself. You know, like summer, winter, you have like a rebirth, and the world flourishes again. And he sort of makes the case in that book that that whole cycle, that human cycles, actually accelerated due to technology, because we were able to separate ourselves from nature, that this cycle happens unconsciously and in much more rapid form than it used to be when it was sort of encased within tradition and in sort of in a guided and aware fashion. And in your work, you sort of, you know, it's very sort of Bitcoin centered, right? I mean, it's crypto, but it's especially Bitcoin plays a very important part in your art, especially in your early art.
No,
Um,
actually, the other way around, my friend. It was body painting and spiritual and human transcendence and the grand narratives were the beginning first 10 years of my career. And then when I got into crypto art in 2017, then that page that you've been taking stuff from, that is more dedicated to the decentralized movement stuff. So, but
true.
there's about, I would say, 400 artworks outside of those. So,
True. Yeah, that's good that you clarify that, because I'm sort of counting from when you became sort of into the crypto space, but
crypto
you have a
space, yeah, my friend.
long period as a digital artist before that time.
15 years now, can you
Yeah,
believe it?
yeah. We should also mention that. But I mean, sort of, I guess what captured you in the whole sort of decentralized movement was Bitcoin, right?
Oh, definitely. I
Yeah.
mean, I saw some documentaries in 2006 about how the fractional lending central banking system works. So I was quite clued up about the nature of money, not what it does, but what it is, which is outside of the public lexicon again, for the most part. And once I dwelled into that and understood it, first it was for me very one-sided, and it was kind of like even activism based, and that then started balancing actually through crypto, because the other value arguments came into it. And first it was a little idealistic that this is going to fix everything, and then you saw how people took that technology and what they did with it. And then it's now much like in art, it's trying to take what has been the tradition of legacy finance for thousands of years, of how it's been utilized and what to learn from it, because there's many times there's no need to reinvent the wheel from there either. It's just absorbing the best parts and implementing those, and then now what is possible through Bitcoin, to take the best part of that and then maybe integrate it into something that could be uh, a good thing altogether. But it might be impossible, because we just have viruses and we have antibodies and we have red and white blood cells and we have the fight of ideas. And sometimes I guess it takes to be for the balance to maintain itself, because we're so easily biased as people. We don't see the whole story. It's impossible. So you need the two confrontational sides to try and keep each other in check. Like, for example, for the longest time, we didn't really have a decentralized system, but the centralized systems weren't so efficient that they could be totally totalitarian.
Hmm.
Now that the technology is to the point that a centralized system can really truly start to be horribly oppressive, Now you have the decentralized system to kind of keep it in a power balance check. And the game dynamics of Bitcoin now, interestingly, is that if you have a massive country like America that bans Bitcoin all of a sudden, then you have something like El Salvador that says, "Hey, give us all of your Bitcoins, because if this goes well, this is a very, very good play for us." So it's an interesting battle of ideas, and this kind of intermixtion of materialistic and immaterialistic things. And what are these value arguments? What are NFTs? Are they actually something, or are they not? And it's a fascinating thing to be able to dwell into as an artist.
Yeah, and what I sort of was getting at was, but you sort of already answered it a little bit. But that sort of generational cycle, you could say it sort of also encapsulates sort of the economic cycle, right? So basically, it is our success that is also eventually our downfall. And because of the centralized system, it becomes so successful in taking away all the effort that we usually have to do ourselves. It sort of makes us lazy and superficial, and then at a certain time it breaks down because people are all asleep behind the wheel, right? And then it goes off the road, and then you get this decentralized space again that sort of is a reaction to that, because Bitcoin was basically a reaction to the system, or the system breaking down,
or divine intervention,
or a divine intervention. And like you said, I think your art and you yourself is somebody who's always trying to find the balance, and I think Bitcoin was sort of a reaction to that imbalance, right? It was also a balancing act, and I think within a decentralized space, of what decentralization represents, is basically the space or the freedom for different groups or voices to be heard and to sort of balance each other out, right? Because if you have one voice who's talking and you have no counter voice, it becomes imbalanced by definition. So,
but can I ask you, not to turn the tables here, but because I know you're so incredibly knowledgeable about art and the decentralized movement, what are you excited about in this? How do you see the merging of creativity and this new renaissance that is upon us? I mean, we could do a whole episode on just your knowledge on this as well, and probably more.
Yeah, I should write that article. But yeah, I'm very excited, because I do think that you basically have this battle, like I've been saying for years now, between centralization and decentralization, and it's coming to a head. I mean, we see it all around us, and the centralized forces are basically bankrupt. I mean, morally, but also literally, and they're trying to keep the game going, and maybe they can, right? That will be the big question. And if they can, it will be totalitarian, because that's the only way to sort of keep the game going. So let's hope they'll lose. That's what we're about, to make them lose. But I do think decentralization and Bitcoin will eventually win. And I think that will be like a huge boost for creativity and for artists, and especially artists like yourself. Because I think with the longer term time preference that Bitcoin stimulates and sort of enhances that kind of thinking, that you start thinking long term, it sort of integrates your whole philosophical idea and your whole philosophical thinking, right? Where these sort of temples of the past come back to life, and hopefully without the suffering that goes along with it. But I think those sort of grand ideas, and those sort of long-term sort of visionary art that you sort of describe with Da Vinci and all those great artists of the past that sort of had this this long-term vision, I think it will return, and I think it is returning, and I think that's a good thing. But for me, the big question mark is, does that also come along with the suffering? I don't think it will, because I think Bitcoin will do something else than for example, the gold system in the past, right? Because the gold was always centralized in a way, right? Because the Babylonians and all these ancient groups and civilizations, they did have sort of the power to centralize it. And I think Bitcoin allows both to be completely decentralized, but to have the sound money system of gold. So I think you will probably have the best of both worlds. It's not perfect, of course. You will still have suffering, but I think it will be more humane.
Well, but that's essentially the problem of the Malays a little bit as well. That if you look at most of the world's religions and their traditions, and what they really say is that the world is kind of like a halfway house, like the school for the soul, of either which you ascend or even descend, if that's the case. That this is not the only even material existence, but beyond that there are realms. And it to me to looks, because I was also very against the whole idea that, you know, art is suffering, you have to suffer as an artist and whatever. Now in reality, like, that's exactly how it's gone. There's been a lot of suffering, and especially with this literal pain in the ass that I have right now, there's a part of it. But I kind of like, because even Jordan Peterson was talking about that, is that, you know, you can say that everything is relative or nothing is real, or debate this and that, but you will have a very hard time debating with pain. And kind of like, if you are a Buddha state, a person, and you go and sit underneath a tree, you might let the rats eat your foot, even. And if you don't have that pain sensory at all, then you might just let your foot go, if you're not on the level of whatever that is. So I think what the religions are trying to say is that we are, to a degree, in a fallen state from the higher frequencies, let's say, and that needs, then that forces a certain amount of suffering. And here are the tools on how to navigate that suffering and alleviate it. But utopia, for that very reason, is that it's not possible within the frequency range of how we exist on Earth not to have suffering. Because even just you're born and your bones grow. I mean, that's going to be suffering, and that can't be negated. And it probably I'm not sure if it should or shouldn't. I'm not smart enough to understand, but I'm starting to, because I was so idealistic before, and try to change how the world works or the universe works without understanding it, and how stupid I feel even trying. It's more like this thing. The spiritual quest is something to try and discover what the laws of the universe are, or if you're more on the God side, just how God's mind works, and us trying to understand it and then integrate with it to navigate and mitigate suffering as much as possible. But I think where we go wrong is to try and say that we shouldn't have any suffering, any challenge, or any unfavorable circumstances, because most of these things that I find to be the biggest revelations have come from hardship. My character has come from hardship. It hasn't come from the things that came easy to me. And if you look at those people who've gotten their lives very easy, they're usually quite fucking insufferable, you know, to all the rest of us. So
Yeah, it's like life starts where your comfort zone ends, right? So you have to seek out these challenges in order to grow. But the problem is that's what I was sort of getting at with you know, we're victims of our own success, you know, with the expanse of technology and it taking away all these challenges, which makes life easier, right? It actually also makes it more insufferable, right? Because a lot of people are sort of trapped in these comfort zones, and it doesn't actually make them very happy, right? I think there's actually a lot of suffering out there of people who look happy on the outside because they're signaling to other people, look at me, I'm very successful, I'm very happy, or whatever. They're actually not that very happy. And I also think what you're also doing is, because this comfort zone has to sort of expand in order for it to work, right? So at some moment that bubble is gonna burst, because it's sort of touches reality, and
yeah,
reality
exactly.
yeah.
I mean, a great example is the North Korean leader. I mean, the defector Yoon Mi Park, this beautiful sort of lady who has an absolutely horrendous story, has been interviewed by many of the biggest podcasts in the world now. Her story, when she tells about the great leader, is that he has different pleasure centers that are kind of like the Aspen of North Korea, that is just dedicated to him. One of which is sexual favors from the young, beautiful women that are isolated there. One is for his back massages and other things, and one is for his entertainment. So the whole of that society is circulated for the optimization of the absolute pleasure of one person that is trying to achieve the nirvana from the materialistic sense without that much material, kind of like spiritual growth. So that he's actually the ultimate example of how far you can try to push the material world to try and be in the state of ecstasy without actually doing spiritual work.
Yeah,
And that's he's quite something to study from anyone who thinks that your malaise is just that you don't have 4 Porsches.
true. And I think dictators are also very interesting in the sense that they're also victims of their own system, right? Eventually they become prisoners of their own system, because doing what they do, they sort of eliminate all trust within the system. So basically, even their own friends become untrustworthy, and they have to be careful, and they have to
Of course. And imagine if he opened up the society now, him and his whole family would be killed in an instant. Once
absolutely.
people understand what they've done to them, that's going to be a bad Tuesday.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the, because talking about El Salvador for one moment is like, you already mentioned it, but it is kind of interesting, because when you tell people like, oh, Bitcoin, El Salvador, they're doing great, and then they say, yeah, but it's a dictator, and technically he is, right? So, but I then say, like, Bitcoin gives you the opportunity to escape. You can escape your own prison, even as a dictator, right? By implementing a Bitcoin standard, you sort of uncorrupt the society. It happens, of course, slowly, probably, but it sort of gives you an escape hatch if you are a dictator, to sort of return to a sound money standard, and to reintroduce.
Not North Korea, bro. That's not gonna happen. Once their internet opens, that's fucking over, man.
Yeah, maybe
if it
they're too
ever
far
does.
gone. Yeah.
So that's like, I don't know if you've heard any of the interviews from Yeonmi Park. I recommend them very hesitantly, of course, because they're so brutally horrific that it's so hard to comprehend from someone coming from a and in this case I would absolutely use the word uh, well, I wouldn't actually. Like, privilege is not the thing. Even Finland. I mean, during the Second World War, we got pummeled through the Russians, and before then, dominated by the Swedes and whatever. And it's a country that has been broken in so many levels, and we were able to utilize democracy and capitalism and a mixture of socialism into this something that really elevated us. But for me, growing up, not having done most of those hard things that my parents and their parents and so forth did in order to elevate the country, looking at my situation growing up in Finland, even though there were many difficulties there as well, then looking at someone who is born into North Korea, it is no contest. We are not on the same page. You cannot ask these people to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, or any of this kind of ridiculous language that might be then coming from the right. If you look at their society, just as an individual, you cannot elevate yourself as an individual within that thing without becoming absolutely psychopathic. So that's it. These are so complicated, these conversations of how
True.
the individual versus the group are possible to elevate.
Yeah, and I think, because you can go so many places, but I think, one of the ways to sort of unclutter your mind is to think about individual against collectivism, right? I think that's a much more useful way to think about how to sort of restore sanity in the world, than to think about left and right and progressive and regressive or conservative. Or what I think all these kind of labels are not very useful to think in. And I think politics itself is kind of unuseful, because first of all, it doesn't solve anything, as we know by now. Secondly, it sort of distorts the issues. And thirdly, it divides. It's almost like when you're talking politics, it's almost like you're talking soccer, right? I'm pro Ajax, I'm pro Feyenoord. It's kind of sort of, it gets you nowhere. So I think it's much more useful if people start to think as individuals, and that's also one of the other things that I really sort of always proclaim about Bitcoin, is it sort of decentralizes people, and as it decentralizes people, it also decentralizes politics, and people start to become independent again, to start be able to think outside of the group as an individual, and to have this sort of individuality or sovereignty, or however you want to call it. And I think
Well,
that's a very healthy aspect.
you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the sovereignty of the individual is kind of like a sacred thing. That's a divine right.
Yeah.
That's something that we collectively a little while ago still agreed is the cornerstone of us kind of growing or the necessity for us to grow up to begin with. But I've come to recently understand a little bit something that is even more of a mathematical issue. That would be, have you heard of the Pareto distribution?
Oh yeah, 2080. Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you kind of reconcile that? Because any institution, any ideology, any organization is, from a creative standpoint, underneath that merciless law that it's the top 10% that produce most of the value, then the top 20 do the 10 after the first 10 produces a lot less, and then 80% nearly nothing. So how do you account for individuality under a graph that says that essentially, as hard and horrible as it sounds, 80% of humanity is trying to do freeloading or copying or aping into the next coin, as they say? So how?
Well, first of all, you will always have discrepancies, and you will always have suffering, and you will always have inequality, right? That sort of that's part and parcel of individuality. And with collectivism, you sort of try to erase those inequalities and that suffering. But the problem is, when you start doing that, at first, you got the low hanging fruit, and then you make progress and you actually alleviate a lot of suffering. But once you go down that route, especially with the fiat standard, and you see that throughout the ages, like they always end up stimulating and enforcing corruption until the whole system breaks down, and you actually create way more suffering and way more inequality and way more everything that you try to alleviate. So I think what you said at the beginning of the interview is like that the traditions and the religions and wise people and sages all through the ages, they try to tell us that you have to deal with your own problems. You have to accept your dark side. You have a light side, but you also have a dark side, and you have to integrate the two, and you have to make the most out of life, right? And I think if you have a society that is more built along, for example, Bitcoin or a sound money system, most of these problems won't go away. But I think because of people actually having to work together and listen together and actually come to a consensus together by doing those things, you have a more healthy and stable and balanced system where you can still help the poor and the suffering, but it won't be it won't be done automatically by sort of printing money, because by printing money you don't have to listen to other people, you don't have to take into account their views, you can just skip the whole thing and print
For a
money.
small while before it collapses.
Well, the small while takes longer than most people thought.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, it's been artificially propped up quite a bit. But
Yeah.
I suppose that's a great sort of way to frame it. And something that I thought about for a little while is that, of course, if you have this pursuit of perfection or the ideal form of human, let's say in Jesus Christ, you have the perfect human that still gets portrayed, and the Son of God who still gets nailed to the cross, and you have to bear it and all that kind of stuff. And if that happens to the best of us, what hope do the rest of us have? But I suppose that's the whole idea of having beauty and consciousness and the impossible standard to try and meet it, is because that optimizes for people to try and achieve something, as opposed to if you overturn it, then you start to idolize essentially weakness or mediocrity or these kinds of things, and then the whole thing comes down. So even though the pursuit of perfection is totally unachievable and utopian, it's still the better version to do that, to try and maintain with that corruption society together, as opposed to the other one. And once I realized that, I started to understand why you have to defend some part of the pursuit of the ideal or the quality or the excellence or the beauty or whatever, because it's a trade-off. If you don't do it, it'll still cost you, and probably worse.
Yeah, and another thing that sort of, when you look into religion, one of the dangers is always that it becomes an absolute, right? So as soon as you deal with absolutes, things also fall apart. That's basically that's happened with postmodernism. I don't hate postmodernism. I think postmodernism has a lot of key insights, but it went off the rails when people treated it as like absolute, like this is the truth, and it sort of derailed all the other theories out there, and it said this is no longer a theory, this is the truth. and that's when it became like acid and mind melting ideology, right? That sort of poisons the mind, because as soon as you start taking ideals as absolutes, it kills your thinking.
Well, this is something that I think is I mean, it's not even it doesn't stop at Cain and Abel, but taking the conversation to Cain and Abel, short story, incredible story about the correct sacrifice or envy or this kind of doing the right or wrong thing, and how that went to Hegel, how that went to Marx, how that went to eventually Herbert Marcuse and so forth, and what's going on right now. It's the spirit of Cain that is described in the Bible, but then if you can take that all the way back to ancient Egypt or further from that, and you'll have the same examples. And I would say that even though religious Puritanism was something that looked absolutely awful to me and still does, even since a kid, it seems that a lot of, like, let's say from the woke side, they're the new Puritans.
True.
And they're trying to craft a grand narrative that because they understand that they need a unifying story, but it's done under race and gender and sexuality and all this kind of stuff. But it still has a very Marxist foundation. But further than that, it's based on victimhood as opposed to gratitude. And the gratitude and victimhood is Cain and Abel, or going much further from all of these different examples from all across the world. So the foundation of postmodernism, if you look at some of the founding fathers from Foucault to Derrida, if you were to infuse, even though they're super complicated, very cleverly narrated and well put together sort of arguments towards what we need to include, I would say they come from the spirit of Cain. And that is why they very often, and resentment, just maybe easier to use the word resentment, they come from resentment. So no matter how clever you put it together, the result is still something that won't increase gratitude, which I believe has been the only thing that has really gotten me out of any trouble in my life, or helped me see why life is beautiful, valuable, real friendship, real conversation, real value contributions. All those things, they mean nothing if you have a mindset of resentment, because then all you'll ever see is problems, and you won't ever accept any progress has happened, because your resentment will focus on the next thing that needs to be solved if someone kind of gives you a pound of flesh from what you wanted. So that's maybe an argument towards, but it's absolutely necessary. I mean, imagine how boring art would be if we would have only if we'd still be painting portraitures with oil paints about the next forest. Fuck that.
No. I mean, you need to have progress, and then I think, I think most of these issues are sort of unavoidable. Like you said, they're human nature, and human nature sort of goes through cycles, and it starts to reappear, and we have to rebattle those sort of shadows that reappear. But I do think certain things can make it much worse, and I think the separation of money and state that is sort of enshrined in the Bitcoin standard. I think people should never have had the power to manipulate money, right? I think money is too important a thing, because it's basically the air we breathe, or if you use fishes, like the water we swim in. Most people have no clue about their surrounding. A fish wouldn't know the water it swims in, but it sort of incentivizes everything you do. And as soon as a group with the best intentions starts messing around with the water or the air we breathe, and starts to notice that it can incentivize like whole populations to do something they wouldn't actually do if they were aware of what they were doing. That kind of power that shouldn't be in the hands of people. And I think that is one of the things that we can sort of solve through this new technology. That really excites me, and that I think would sort of elevate the individual over the collective, because I'm not against collectives, right? I'm not against groups, but I think it should be groups of individuals, and not the sort of mindless drones that are following somebody. And I think in that way you can have a society with a 20-80 Pareto distribution, but with the 20 actually caring about the 80, and the 80 actually doing their best to,
It's a two-way street.
doing the best to their abilities to sort of participate in that society. Because I think the real problem is the free rider problem, and the free rider problem gets worse and worse once you sort of start messing around with the money, right? It starts once you sort of discover that, oh, if I pull this lever, I get free candy, right? Before you know it, everybody is pulling that handle until the machine doesn't work anymore.
Well, we're very close to that point.
Yeah,
getting to that point to collapse. But yeah.
But so for the artists out there, I think, and especially people like yourself, but I think every good artist is sort of in tune with his or her surroundings and the sensibilities of people and trying to express them. But
It's the suffering, because if you're in tune with this thing, you're suffering.
Yeah, but basically artists are breathing the air or swimming in the water that we all swim in, right? So they're giving expression to their surroundings that they find themselves in. And then you've got some artists that can sort of look beyond that. They are the fishes that can see the land, or the so they are giving expression to a bigger vision, that there's more to life than just the water, or that there's also space outside of Earth. That they're giving sort of a grand or expanding vision that people can aspire to. And I think you're one of them.
Work is a necessity. We all need to work to be. Most people I know, I don't, maybe there's crazy exceptions or something like that, but work is associated with suffering, and work is something that I can't not do and even try to maintain a moderate amount of happiness. So it's a two-way street again, and a blade, because I don't want to do work. Sometimes I want to be lazy and unproductive and this kind of thing, and at the same time, then that's the source of anything that is sustainable in a way that makes life worth living. That's a real dilemma.
Yeah. I mean, as an artist, but also, if you're like an analyst or a thinker, or you're always sort of struggling with, your normal life and in your friendships and family and your obligations, worldly obligations, and living in that sort of abstract realm where you're free to.
But can I ask you? Do you believe that evil exists?
Well, I do read a lot about evil because it's a very fascinating topic, right? I mean, they used to believe it existed.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
But and there was a period in my life that I didn't believe it existed. But then there was also the period in my life that I didn't know what sound money was and and Bitcoin and stuff. And sort of looking at what is happening in the world today and where I think things are headed, and the people who must, I mean, at 10 years ago, I might still thought that they, had no clue what they were doing, but they simply must know what they're doing, at least to some degree. And if you know where things are going and they're still going in that direction, then for me, evil is a reality, right? I mean, I think most people aren't evil, and maybe even those that are sort of inclined to evil behavior are not fully evil. And you could also make the argument that psychopaths, for example, are not evil; they're just what they are, right? They're predators.
Form of life.
Yeah. Like you could say, for example, I have sort of a discussion with my friends about sort of the cycle and the system we are living in. And you could say, like, at some point the system that we're living in has reached this sort of tipping point where it starts to decay, right? Where actually the things that used to benefit society become sort of then it sort of dissolves society. And then at that point, sort of the carrions start landing on the carcass, right? This carcass starts rotting, and it attracts carrions. And these carrions, you could say, are sort of the psychopaths who see, oh wait, there's a carrion over there, let's land and take advantage of. So perhaps it's just a natural cycle, and it sort of stimulates evil behavior. So is evil relative or absolute? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, but it definitely is out there. as
And the
a
perspectives,
force.
because I can say also from my side, and what's been, because I contend with that. Sometimes some things that are labeled as evil are nothing but ignorance, and sometimes things that are kind of we think is nothing but natural something can actually, from a different perspective, all of a sudden appear totally evil. But
True.
for example, me as a Western liberal educated Finnish person coming to live in Dubai and be more and further infused in Islam, and some of the ways that I was taught to see it through, as opposed to then integrate here and see it happen in real life and in people, and getting to understand the tradition, see it what it's refusing to accept into itself, because in fact some of the things pushed on it and said that why Islam would be evil are the things that they very much want to resist, because they're resisting evil. And when you start to see it from the other point of view, you start to see all the different power struggles and different kinds of things, and the spiritual combat that goes along with it. So it's been a real education to start to see it from the other side and start to see the Western propaganda machine do its thing as opposed to represent it. So often, like let's say in the conversation of men and women today, men who would be misogynistic, they would take the worst example of a woman and say and generalize that is the woman. And then the women, which happens often these days, is that they take the worst example of a man and say that is the whole of man. Yeah. And that's the kind of, like, if you come from a high place to the lowest place and not meet in the middle, or even have the highest ideas of both of those. And I suppose that's what I try to do with my art, is that of course I need to address what is the lowest points of any part of that spectrum, or the middle of it, but what I try to achieve is, with these arguments, have the highest arguments battle with one another, because then the frequency is really high. Because if the pendulum slows at the very low end of the spectrum, not only is your body and mind in the mud constantly, and that would be the suffering part, and then maybe the middle class of ideas is doing the work of something, and then the highest peak of the pyramid is essentially, once you've done that work, then you can have some things that are relatively easy, because you've reached a high vibrancy of what it's really about. And I think at best that is what art can be. It can be a portal to access higher states quicker, because through an example of an artistic immersive experience, that's not something that you will experience when you do it from an office cubicle, when you're doing accounting for a company. It's just a totally different mindset. And that's why you see high art in the high institutions, like today in the Museum of the Future. There were many different aspects of art represented there, and it's not really something that is part of the public lexicon, unfortunately, anymore in the West, as it used to be. Like let's say, for example, in Renaissance Italy. In Renaissance Italy, the highest art belonged to the peasants as much as it belonged to the kings, even though, of course, our ability to interpret a lot of it is somewhat of a different level. But the art itself needed to be profound to the degree that it didn't need an explanation in order for it to seep throughout society, to hold it together as a construct. And that was together with religion, together with government, together as a cohesive state. And I would say that is one thing that has absolutely stunned me and impressed me about the United Arab Emirates, is that kind of spirit is here. You have the leadership, you have the government, you have the art, you have the advancements into the metaverse, the digital implementation. All of that is a synergistic package, as opposed to something that is very contrarian and fighting and battling constantly. And of course you can critique it, and I understand why you would do that, but it took me a while. It took me 3 years to understand how this place works, even to the degree of letting go of my own preconceived notions about how a Westerner thinks, what is not actually possible to integrate here without it messing up the whole system that seems to be actually working quite beautifully. So it you know.
Yeah, no, and yeah, I fully agree with that, right? I mean, evil can also be a matter of perspective, totally, right? I mean, for me and for others, Jerome Powell sometimes comes across as like, some kind of crazy maniac that's destroying the world. He's doing his, he's doing a lot to create that image of himself. But you could say from his perspective of, the people that he hang out with and the task that he has taken upon his shoulders, is of course almost an impossible task, right? Because many people have explained that if, for example, if America would default on its debt, we would go back to the Stone Age, right? We could go back to the 1500s if America just said like, okay, the debt ceiling's there, goodbye. We're saying goodbye to our debts. The whole euro dollar system would implode, and
For the West, it would be, but not for Middle East, not for China, not necessarily for Africa, not for Russia. I mean, the BRIC thing is already a reality, and the petrodollar is nearly gone. So even though devastating, and who knows what they're going to do with their military and kind of like as a back to the corner superpower, but just respectfully, I don't agree that if America goes, that the rest of the world goes.
No, but I mean, they will go, right, and then I think they will diminish, and the baton will probably go east and towards the BRICS, and I think that that's a good thing, right? I think, and it's inevitable. It's like a natural cycle. But the system is so complex and so integrated and so sort of interdependent and reliant, that if one of these superpowers would just drop out, all of a sudden, the system would become so imbalanced that it would create huge havoc, right? Because of the outstanding debts, and the euro dollar system is actually not even sort of directly related to America. That is sort of running on its own course. That sort of originated organically after World War II, without even a lot of American intervention. But America at the end, sort of, America took advantage of the organic system that grew out of that whole process, and it's basically completely weaponized. So I totally understand that the BRICS want to get out of it, as though everybody else, because it's sort of eating its own children, right? But to come back to the sort of the evil question, yeah, you could say that Jerome Powell is trying to the best of his ability to get a sinking Titanic to the nearest port or something along those lines, without creating a panic, like saying, okay, we're sinking, right? And then everybody at the same time runs to get a lifeboat.
Well, but isn't that the classic example of the whole thing, of how many people foundationally today, philosophy-wise, and probably them not knowing, are quite Marxist. And the idea is that within Marxist theory, you don't really have nature. So you don't have the waves, you don't have the cosmos, you don't have the stars colliding into each other and expanding into new realms. You don't have natural law as a part of the conversation, because it's a superhuman centric. Ultimately, that's why a narcissistic concept, and why it keeps failing, is that it can't take into consideration what is going on in natural cycles, and that is often lacking in our conversations, and why it keeps re-emerging, and why, because we're sort of selfish creatures and we want things easy, and that relates to the Pareto thing and many things. But it can't never work unless if it becomes more holistic, the way that we look at these things. And I know that when I talk about spirituality, that most people, especially in the West, I look like a crazy person, because who would know, even talk like that? Why would you be interested in those kinds of ideas? And let alone show your own face when you talk about those kinds of things? Isn't that embarrassing? There are many people who think like that, and all the Richard Dawkins and their absolute fundamentalism in the way that they look at the world, and still refuse to even take one psychedelic because they're essentially cowards. That's a part of the whole thing is, like, when we talk about evil and those kinds of things as well, I've come to see that cowardice is also a massive part of the problem. And I say that with a lot of empathy because I also associate myself as a coward. There are many, many times throughout my life that I could have had the option to do the brave thing and I haven't, or I have had the opportunity to say something and I haven't. But I've also done the other way. I've done the brave thing and I've paid the price for doing the brave thing. And that can be a very painful, exclusionary, horrible experience that gets me out of material comforts or career advancements. Or so whether you do the right thing or the wrong thing, evil or the good thing, or the brave or the cowardice thing, it's an absolutely painful road to see the trade-off, because no matter what you do, you're going to end up part regretting it and part being happy with it. And it's that juxtaposition of it all that you have to come into terms with. And to be absolutely honest, I mean, this part of this conversation is absolutely terrifying because we're actually talking, and the likelihood of having an actual conversation about these kinds of topics and not offend anyone or not get on anyone's wrong side or right side is absolutely impossible. There would be even if many people resonate with a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about, there will be some people who absolutely think that something that I've said or you said is so ignorant and stupid that we should be negated as human beings from participating in any public conversation, because who are these assholes and privileged white boys or whatever it is, and why don't they even understand the basics of this and that? So it is what it is. But I think in this context, I think I'm now finally old enough and moderate enough to comment upon things that I understand them enough in order to know my own ignorance about them and be brave enough to express that, as well as some of the things that are really hard to talk about, like God or cosmos or the woke movement or philosophy. I mean, I admit I'm mostly an idiot and an ignoramus, but there are some things that I've done in order to, at least I feel I've done enough to be able to participate without being that I feel that there's some contribution that I'm doing that might give someone something.
Yeah, but even the economy, right? I mean, the more I learn about the economy, two things sort of always surprise me. One is that it's in the basics, it's very simple. Right? It's all supply and demand, but the thing that's built on top of it is so complex, and there's so many cross currents, right? I have no clue. I always discover new things and stuff that I didn't know, and that things are even more complex than I eventually thought. And the same thing is with crypto and Bitcoin, right? It's at some level it seems very simple and comprehensible, and then there's stuff built on top of that 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 you're just scratching the surface. So, like you say, there's so many stuff that I don't know, and I wouldn't presume or claim to be an expert on. But you try your best as a person to sort of guide people to the right sources and to do their own thinking and to raise issues and ask questions, and sometimes to provide sort of preliminary answers to. And I think as an artist, you try to expand people's minds and their field of vision. And I think you have, like I sort of mentioned halfway through, is like you sort of have two kinds of artists. You have those artists that are swimming the current and are giving expression to that environment, and which is great, right? But you also have artists that are trying to expand it, to look beyond it, and to and I think that within philosophy and sort of the traditional art that we mentioned, what you see is that the traditional artist is more somebody who gives expression to his own view of everything, right? So it's basically he put his own soul on the line, or his work is infused with his soul. So it is like an expression to all that he or she is. And with most modern artists, and especially the artists that I don't really like that much, are the I'm not a really big fan of Andy Warhol. I hope I don't offend everybody.
Me neither. He's the beginning of the fall.
And you got Jackson Pollock. I mean, they're artists, and I
like Pollock though.
Yeah, well, I do I do, but and because they're original, like I sort of value their originality and sort of their passion that they put into their work, and sort of and they might have a sense of color, and then so they're original. But then you get
Well,
a lot
Pollock
of
is like chaos theory. I mean, that's
no.
that's like the. Sorry.
No, that's okay, right? I mean, I do. I mean, Warhol, he did create a lot of stuff, right? So, and he inspired a lot of people, and he gave sort of expression to an age, and in that way, he's very important, and I can sort of respect him as a great artist. And
Well, he started the consumerist critique, but this is what annoys me about the postmodernist education, that now most of the time, when even in the crypto space, you want to kind of equate Bored Apes as art. The art critique that is high level starts the justification of Bored Apes from Andy Warhol and not from before. So it's not, you can have the Luxor temple as the standard of art, and then you can try and reference Bored Apes to that and see how far you go. But this is part of the thing, is like I was saying earlier, is like beauty as a
concept.
As a concept. I mean, I look like a boiled potato these days. I'm 44. I can't compete for any kind of attention with my sort of outer world. My wife is laughing in the background, So, but I found my way to be useful to beauty, to take universal beauty from the world and infuse that into art to be in service of it. So even though I don't get adored as someone who anyone compliments on my looks, I get compliments on the beautiful things that I produce, or hopefully someone else for their beautiful values that they hold inside, or beautiful poetry, or for you to stand up for freedom or expression. These are beautiful things that we can, despite outer appearances or superficial things, we can be in the surface of a beautiful society developing and harmonious things. So that's really something that I think is worth fighting for, and not just giving up on things that are hard, even though it's not. So I don't remember who said this, but they said that art is something, because we talked about inflation and fiat and all of this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Art is as inflated as a term these days as anything else can be, and probably spirituality too. We might have even touched upon that before. But the great definition of art that I've heard thus far is that art is something that makes you feel proud to be a human being.
Yeah.
And that's a near impossible standard to achieve, but that would be when something deserves that title. So I was very hesitant to ever give myself the title of an artist, because then I would have to hold myself to an impossible standard of producing every single work or do everything that I do to the degree that I would be proud to be a human being because I've done that. And that's obviously utter nonsense and an impossibility. But I have achieved it a couple of times throughout this whole thing, and that is the objective. But I think that would be the appropriate definition of it.
And I think you can also say outward or inward, right? So some artists are more inspired by what exists, and sort of and within, and try to work within a tradition or within a paradigm, and you got those artists that sort of get their inspiration from inside. That they also get it from outside. Of course, you always get it from outside, but they're sort of their what really ignites their passion is sort of giving expression to what's inside of themselves. And I think those are, I think, the most powerful artists, where you combine both of these and give expression to them, like with your whole being. Basically, what you said with the human being. That I think that's basic. That is what I would say is like a definition of true art, is where the whole being, where the whole human being give expression to him or herself to the fullest, if that's even
absolutely.
possible.
And I'm totally unemployable to any company or anything else. So it's this. There's no plan B. We work with companies. We do many cool things with a lot of different organizations or whatever. But for me to, at this point, jump out of art and go work on an organization, that's never going to happen. So I have to figure this out. There's no.
Well, that forces you back on yourself, right? So, and that's, you know, that's a good thing. That's where the challenge is, and then that sort of ignites your imagination and your passion. So you're forced back on yourself, and you have to deal with it and come with solutions. And I think you're doing an amazing job doing that.
Likewise, my friend.
Thank
You
you.
give such an amount of voices and bring together community in and under pressure. I mean, you've gone through your own cancellations and removals of your channels and whatever for things that were saying things that weren't anything more than common sense just a while ago. So
True.
to conserve some of the things that are worth conserving and evolving with some of the things that really truly need progress is a very difficult field to do, especially today, now that often progress can actually feel and be a very much like regress and the other way around. So, but here again, it's the expansion of things. And I think you even retweeted this one tweet, like you have done many times before, which I always appreciate, is that I identify as the cosmos in motion. I identify as a human being with my limitations that is trying to evolve my consciousness more and more, expanding it to be more aware of things. And what I have an issue with the current language that is being used, that the further smaller increments that you try to make your identity to be about, the more you get into a war with your essential eternal self. And predictably, that's going to lead you to suffer more, have depression, and many of these kinds of mental issues that you're going to have because you're trying to separate yourself from reality or the cosmos. And by reality, I'm not speaking something like, okay, reality is a drag, but by, what is the reality of the universe? And that is a magnificent explosion of everything. And if that is who you fundamentally are, and we try and make ourselves these encapsulated egos or even smaller fragments of those, the more suffering that's going to intake on us. So what I try and do is to focus on of course, bring out the problem, like here, which is going to be a problem for many people who are super invested into these smaller and smaller increments and categories. But the truth is that if you expand into this cosmos or awareness or consciousness about the nature of the world and how we relate to it in the big picture, then you solve the problem. And if that takes a little bit of courage, or some part I get excluded out of the conversation because I bring it up, so be it.
Yeah.
But it's the truth as best that I can see it. And if I don't say that, then I'm lying and being totally useless, because then I'm not contributing something that is imparted on me from great, fantastic teachers like, Ken Wilber, the father of integral theory, who helped me understand how to make art on this level that I do. Or many self-help people, even from Wayne Dyer to all of these sort of disturbing elements or disruptors, or those who've said the difficult thing. But for those who are not reading them like the devil reads the Bible, you will see into their heart and their purpose of what they want to do. And those are the people I want to reach and build with. And essentially, without me wanting to be a tribal animal, there will be those who resonate with the things that I say or do, and they will be attracted to it. And then there are those who are repulsed by it. And as a social animal, I find it as difficult as anyone else does, that the repulsion part or the rejection part is difficult to handle and uncomfortable. And I wish it wasn't so. But then you're just coming from a point of weakness, and that will never get you respect. And as a man, if you don't get respect, you don't feel loved. So that's a bad
Well,
cycle.
I think that's the curse of an artist, right? Because you want to give expression to your individual core, but the more you do that, the more idiosyncratic it becomes, and that means that a lot of other people who have a different resonate on a different level will be either don't feel it or might be repulsed by it, and that's something sort of like a recurring problem, I think. But if you don't do it right, if you try to please and pander to everybody, if you go with the flow or with the crowd, then you might please a lot of people, but your art becomes very flat and not very durable. So that's sort of the trade-off that I guess most artists have to make, or and maybe some don't even think about it or do it unconsciously, or don't mind in which category they sort of fall. And I like both of them, right? I mean, you need both of them. It's not like that, but I do think you also need these people that, you know, have to give expression to their inner core in order for us to elevate all of us, right? So because these are sort of Leibniz would say monads, like sort of like windows into the soul, like a unique soul gives expression to itself, and that is like a total uniqueness, like that's that person in that spot, in that time, in that space, giving expression to him or herself. And that's like a diamond in the one of those pure diamonds.
So repression is anti-art. You know, it's that whole thing is like part of this conversation that makes it so enjoyable is that it's like a song, because it's not premeditated. It's not trying to be controlled. Like, imagine if this was something like you would have sent me a list of things that I can or cannot say, or, you know, vice versa, or whatever, as opposed to just being two grown-ups who are wise enough to moderate themselves, to understand who they are and what they're about to say. And because of that level of unconscious or conscious uncontrollability of it, I think some people who might listen to this can really enjoy it in motion. And that's part of why some things are elevated from the collective as rewarded things, because they require that kind of courage to put that out there, despite the different kind of backlash that the feral internet might throw upon you for doing so. But what makes life worth living? And is there, you know, many of these great stories, the hero myths, what they talk about is that, what makes life worth living? And is there something worse than death? And is there something worse than the kind of participation in the herd mentality? How much will that take away from your soul? How much will that take away from your ability to be alive while you are alive, as opposed to die for the sake of others and their agendas, even though you're still breathing? And I think if you put it in that context, then it becomes the choice of becoming your full self and growing and expanding becomes the only option, because most people, when really pressed, they don't want to die. They want to be a part of this whole thing and see where they fit. And, you know, that's...
Yeah, it's kind of funny, because when you're young, you want to try to fit in because it feels bad that you're on the outside. And when you're grown up, you actually want to get out. You want to be someone unique, but that's sort of like you're continually, I think Jordan Peterson calls it like you have to die ego deaths again and again so that you can grow, right? It's sort of and that's a painful process, and a very scary process. And like you, right? I also had many times, and still do, that you don't want to do things, or that you're scared to do things, or that. And I totally agree that courage as a virtue is totally disappeared from everybody's mind. And I think that courage should actually be one of those core virtues that it once was, and it should be, but it's not easy to live up to it, right? I mean, most people just want to fit in and not stand out and go.
Well, also the consequences have ramped up. I mean, part of saying anything against the forced narratives that we get from media or otherwise ideology or whatever it is, the consequences are very real, and most people don't have a safety net. They don't have Bitcoin to fall to, or any other default, so that if you're someone who has a family and all of a sudden you're let known that in this workplace we have this environment and these are the rules, and if you go against them, then you're out. So many people have to do absolutely impossible decisions, because most of those decisions don't only involve them, they involve their extended family and friends. And even bringing up things in conversation, sort of wanting to be tactful and polite and be with society. And it's difficult to bring up conversations because they polarize so easy that I have friends who are super social, like incredible people who you would only call glue, of how well they curate their friends and parties and things like that. And many of them have said that they find it nearly impossible to have dinner parties anymore, or to even curating wise put together people in the Western setting, because they devolve into fights and kind of horrible atmospheres. So it's like we have this new etiquette that we don't really know how to conduct ourselves on the internet, and now with the idea polarization this badly also in real life. So you constantly see in the Twitter feed, at least for me, there's these horrific sort of examples of violence ramping up, the aggression kind of coming to the surface, and people robbing, murdering, just all of this stuff that is just so alarming to see. And maybe that is the wave. I mean, energetically wise, you look at is this leading us to a third world war? What does that look like? How does this whole thing pan out? It's difficult to see, but it's certainly not going into a more peaceful direction at the moment.
No, it's a very painful process, and that's of course, what we talked about earlier is, people not wanting to make a choice, not trying to get out of their comfort zone. If the comfort zone doesn't expand, it starts to shrink and shrink, and it sort of forces this collectivism to become more and more narrow, and to force people's behavior. And one of the things with Bitcoin Live that we always sort of try to explain to people, and was one of our sort of core values or mission statements, was, to get people into Bitcoin, at least a little bit, or gold or silver or whatever, right? But something that is sort of outside of the system, so that you have a lifeboat. Because if everybody has a lifeboat or life jacket or whatever, then when the boat sinks, it's not that much of it won't destroy that much, right? And then people can still think clearly, and they won't panic, and you can get to safety. But if like the majority of the people are still on the boat, and they are, right, the people are starting to notice that there's something wrong with the boat. They maybe most haven't realized that it's sinking, but it's wobbly and it's acting weird, and it sort of forces this sort of mob mentality, this panic and aggression, where people start turning on each other, which is very normal. But it's very sad to see, and it's very sad that people didn't have taken the time to prepare, or to
And that's going to be super interesting also, is like from that standpoint, is the narrative wars and the propaganda stuff, is that now that AI is very soon indistinguishable from, let's say, someone like you or me, who've been a lot on recorded media, that this what we've just now been talking about all of a sudden could be twisted into, even if you just took a third of this interview and did something with it, with AI trying to make us say things that we haven't said, or stand for things that we don't stand for, and kind of muddy the waters. We're living the last bit of media age where we can actually trust our eyes and ears of what is being presented to us, of who people were and what they stood for. I mean, that was something that was really cool about the whole thing, of, at least as a first attempt, let's say on Twitter, that first it was the status game blue check, and now it's trying to be a utility blue check, but you still can't get rid of the bots. You still can't get rid of the non-identity. Should you get rid of the non-identity? Probably not. All of these kinds of things. But essentially, it's something to do with, really, I thought it was so ridiculous that these sort of multi-millionaires are bitching on Twitter about how they'd have to pay $8 to participate in this company that is trying to get back to being profitable, and then actually having utility to that check mark, as opposed to the most purest form of elitism and status game playing. And it was so pathetic, really. Obviously, the new solutions aren't ideal yet, but still going towards something that, at least for that money that you're providing, longer videos and all that, whatever, I think was a healthy direction. But how do we moderate conversations? How do you know that those people who you're following are actually saying the things that they're saying? Unless if you can verify that, something that is my artwork, in fact, if it's not a decentralized solution coming from my NFT wallet that can be backtracked, all of these verification issues is a massive thing. And of course, without the decentralized versions of what we now have as available, like the digital land ownership, all of these kinds of things, if you don't have blockchain, I mean, this is like, God bless Bitcoin. I mean, it's the divine intervention of that virgin birth of a mechanism that we so desperately need for the digital era, and how much it's been demonized and misused, and the amount of innovation and amazing necessary beauty that it's bringing to the world is still, like, after 6 years, I've seen all the scammers and garbage that it's poured onto the world now as well, in the kind of hype form and whatever. But I still absolutely fundamentally believe in the technology, and it's provided me to have a different life, and allowed me to have more brave conversations as well, because I'm not so susceptible and at the mercy of the central kind of variety. So
Yeah, but
it's beautiful.
that's basically what I said earlier. You know, it decentralizes people. It gives you your own voice, right? You are now able to express yourself freely, or at least, you know, as free as possible, as humanly possible, because you have that sort of safety net. You are decentralized. You got your anchor, so to speak. And but those people who are in the centralized system, they are starting to lose more and more of themselves, and they have to go faster and faster on the treadwheel to keep going, and it becomes harder and harder for them to actually dislodge themselves from that system. And that's something that's very worrisome. And I really hope that we won't get a world war. If it's up to me, we won't, and I'll do my best to wake people up and to not go there. But like what you said with AI, I mean, you see all these things, they feed, you got like a feedback mechanism, and the feedback mechanism, like AI, but you got countless, and the fiat system, but you have countless of these negative feedback systems that can only lead to totalitarian solutions. Because, like you say, how do you know with AI sort of impersonating people, and when people can no longer trust their eyes and ears to take information to them, then the only logical option is total control. And to, you know, get an authoritarian check mark and say, okay, this is the official view, and these are real people because we checked them, the system checked the narrative, and it's all good, right? And the alternative is a decentralized system. But a decentralized system is a danger for those in control, right? Because that takes basically away all their power. Because then they're
Plus a paradise for the scammers and assholes, because they don't get to take any accountability to taking grandma's money and doing rug pulls with their variety of 10,000 collectible NFT projects. So I would just say that it's not paradise, bro, on the other side either.
No. But I mean, the danger is more local, right? It's more individual. So it's more like a Wild West, where you have good cowboys and bad cowboys, and people have to make their own decisions. And but on the other end, it's like hell.
Man, what a, like, if as a maybe point of something that is still feels like a contribution, I would like to promote someone who really helped me. This was in 2016 in London. I had no money whatsoever. I was living under the most miserable conditions possible in nearly a bike shed that had mold and that gave me asthma, and eventually my dog lung cancer and whatever. And it was that era before Bitcoin and crypto art and NFTs, and that struggle as a digital artist for a decade, and being ideologically taken into one way. I went to a very left-wing film school that indoctrinated me to think about certain things certain way, and then kind of leading to these different ideas of how, starting to listen to Jordan Peterson, starting to listen to of course NLP from Richard Bandler. That was a massive shift in paradigm in thinking, and before then Ken Wilber and others. But specifically this one person in 2016 changed a lot, called Dr. John DeMartini.
Okay.
And I couldn't have afforded his course. It was quite embarrassing. I went to a pre-meetup of his meeting, and I offered him an artwork as a compensation if I could come and join his course. And he kindly enough let me in, and he saw that there was something in me enough to let me to this quite expensive 2-day experience. And he had this vision of, first of all, he said that life in one basic, if you slice it into a pie, it can be put into 7 different slices. That it's your sort of religion or God or spirituality. You have your philosophy, you have your vocation, you have your family, you have your health, and you have your money, essentially. And those 7 different segments, you have to master all of them to a relative degree, because essentially we all know a rich person who's miserable, because if they don't have any kind of chips in the let's say the relationship or health part, they might be falling apart in their body and everyone in their family hates them or whatever it is, but they still have a lot of money, so other people envy them because they don't really see the situation at hand. But if you want to be a balanced human being, you need to have a vision and then go towards that, because that helps you go through the good times in a graceful way, and it helps you go towards your goals when it's really difficult, even though all you see is obstacles at times. And he married those together under this pattern, through which I was forced to, in these 2 16-hour, and I think the second day was even longer, 18-hour day, where through this mathematical formula, he forced my brain to remember things that I didn't remember, in order to try and get my perception to be balanced, as opposed to how imbalanced it was at that moment in time. And after going through this grueling process and being challenged on my perceptions a lot, because I was quite woke at that moment in time, still, I was very much along the lines of the conversation of where we are now. And he helped me balance that. It was part my resentment of, because he asked me to identify the biggest resentment that I had in my life. And then once I identified that person, I started working on the template of correcting the wrong perception of this person, of whether it's just evil or good. And that after the 2 days was done, this mathematical formula that was really hard to do, because I really didn't want to go there. I didn't want to think about this person. I didn't want to give them the time of day, that I would balance my perception that they would have actually been a good person when I thought that they were a bad person, and those kinds of things. Once I got to the end of that thing, the badness of that person collapsed to be neutral. Not incorrect, as in like all of a sudden they're just good or bad, but his perception of the world is that we need the negative thinking so that we don't become delusional in a positive sense, and we need the positive thinking so that we don't become negative in a bitter sense. And that is the balance, and the way to go forward towards that is mastery and vision. And once that happened to me, once the biggest resentment in my mind collapsed, all of a sudden 100 smaller ones collapsed, and I saw the world more clear. I felt like a noise that had been inside of my head my whole life went away, and I could see things more clearly and become fully myself and go towards the future without that much resentment. And I wish these kinds of tools were more available to people, because it would have been impossible for someone to tell me that this person wasn't mostly bad before this process happened in me and energetically released this thing that allowed me to see the world more correct. So that's the basic problem, is that we see the world as we are, as opposed to how the world really is. And we're this filter machine, and unless if we're willing to do the work to remove those filters and open enough, and then sometimes conserve our soul enough in order to go towards it with our best kind of way, it's impossible. So in one way, when we're having these cultural conversations with people, and I understand that they haven't had similar experiences to me, like psychedelic experiences or hypnosis or these kinds of courses or whatever it is, if they haven't been as feverishly searching for this stuff as I have, to change your opinion and your cultural lens is nearly impossible. So this is why I'm not really no longer talking to those who I would see as, let's say, ideologically possessed, or they're fully traumatized and looking at the world through their trauma only, and projecting that onto the world and wanting for everyone else to kind of pander to their trauma. First of all, I don't do that because I didn't try to do it. I tried to grow my best out of all of those situations so that I would be more of value and access that gratitude. But I know it's impossible to talk to those people, because also I was impossible to talk to. And so all I can do is tell my personal story and say that this is why I would say this is valuable to promote this person, because I think his contribution to the current humanity, even though he's famous, but he's not that well known. And especially his process and what he does is not that well known. So once that would become more accessible, and that would become a part of the, let's say, the education system to the degree that it can, because it's actually just a mathematical fill the form formula when some other people help you go through it, that's worthwhile talking about.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think, and I will also put that link underneath the video, because that will, I think, be very helpful to many people, because, you know, our perspective can cloud our judgment, definitely. And then there's so many sort of filters that we look to and that are sort of given to us. And I think another thing that you also sort of touched upon is, you know, dependency, right? So basically the current system is creating these dependencies, and these dependencies are getting worse and worse. And the more dependent you are on anything, the more it clouds your vision, and it makes you blind for the things that influence you without your knowing yourself. Because that's basically those points that you mentioned. Is if you're unhappy for one of those areas that you do not have control over, you start reacting out your frustration on other things, or, you know, it starts to cloud your vision. And if you have independence and you get control of your own life, then a lot of these issues that you thought you had turn out not to be real issues at all, right? Yeah.
Well, my friend, but if you permit me, because my pinched nerve is starting to tell me things about the sit down. I could talk with you for hours and hours. If I can just express, like, I'm deeply grateful for our conversations, because this is the kind of thing that I would hope most of the conversations that I have are on this kind of level. And this is true. This is about as happy as it gets, you know, for me, that when I get to be a part of this kind of conversation, and the spirit is really of contribution and exploring what it is to be a human. It's not a common thing that you can do with many people. So, Nicolas, I think you're a rock star. So
thank you. Right back at you, Vesa. So keep on doing what you're doing, keep making those amazing arts, and I'll just keep retweeting them.
Appreciate it deeply. I hope the audience had a good time. If you made it with us all the way to here, kudos for you.
True that. It's longer than normal, but I really enjoyed it, and you're always welcome back.
Thank you, my friend.
Take care, Vesa.